Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us again for the Kaplan Education Foundation's series on Black education. This is our fourth presentation in the series. Today's lesson is going to be looking at the question of education as a civil right, resisting the resegregation of public schools. And before I get into the lesson, I want to share that, if you've been following the series, you'll see that we're trying to follow somewhat of a timeline. And in this lesson, we're going to be capturing almost 100 years worth of history. And rather than try to, kind of go through each piece of this history, I decided on a different approach. And so I hope this is beneficial to all of us. It is not possible to fully comprehend the forms and forces of oppression Black people have had to resist and overcome without first appreciating the magnitude of the oppression within the field of education. Among the obstacles and impediments erected in the history of the U.S. against African Americans, the obstacles to educational access and achievement serve as the foundation in the hierarchy of institutional racism. As the gateway to careers which then lead to wealth accumulation and housing, education is the critical cornerstone of the advancement of any people. Remove that platform or put efficient blockades in its path, and you will have effectively shackled that community to the dungeons of generational poverty with little hope of escape. For African Americans, generational poverty and all its snares and entanglements have not occurred haphazardly, but by conscious, deliberate design. The engine for every form of institutional racism one could name: police brutality, mass incarceration, employment or housing discrimination, is oiled by the discriminations Black people have experienced in the fields of educational attainment. So here I have a model just to show the way in which, just to visualize, again, 100 years of history in essence, with respect to this question. So as you see there, we have a cycle, and this cycle represents the chain of generational poverty. The levels of discrimination that Black people have experienced, if you watch the lesson prior, that talked about the development of public schools. As we move into the 20th century, the 1900s, we find laws enacted state by state, beginning in the South, but in certain places, even in the North, that put restrictions on Black folks' access to public schools. In certain cases, erecting entirely separate districts where Black students then went to school that were dilapidated, where they had lack of resources and lack of funding. As we know, one needs a decent education in order to get decent employment. And so clearly there's a link there between one's educational development and one's employment opportunity. And certainly one's ability to gain housing is largely determined by one's income, one's wealth accumulation, or at least one's ability to accumulate wealth and how that plays into our credit system. And absent all of those paths or there being effective obstacles, as I shared earlier, in those paths, then one finds oneself vulnerable to being caught up in the criminal justice system. Later on in the presentation, I'll make that link between education and the criminal justice system a little clearer. But what I want folks to truly appreciate is that with respect to the African American experience in the United States, the 20th century was the critical century in which this cycle was formed and developed, in certain cases by the erection of laws, by the passing of legislation, both at the federal level and at the state and county level, that locked Black people out of opportunities that were made available to white folks. And it is that lock that we ought to pay critical attention to, because even in certain areas where that lock, that legislative lock, may have been lifted or unlocked, the legacy of that period in which it was locked remains with us to this day. These laws, this cycle, for most of us in this country has been taken for granted. Yet it is the consequence of a century of legislation that has had a lasting impact. The very development of the middle class, the very image of what we think of when we think of the Midwest, of the suburbs, is the story of how the US government, through various legislative means, lifted out of poverty into generational wealth an entire generation of those who are now understood to be white Americans. This was done with the expressed exclusion of African Americans at every point and measure. Beginning with the Homestead Act of 1862, the Social Security Act of 1935, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, also known as the GI Bill of Rights, and the redlining and racially restrictive housing covenants that followed. These acts taken together enable the development of wealth accumulation and inheritance for an entire generation of families who heretofore were threatened by the mere proposition of competing with newly freed Black workers. So formulaic and embedded in the internal social construct of this country, this cycle has become that one can, with scientific certainty, predict the life outcomes of entire families just by knowing their zip code. This is the structural in structural racism. Equal protection clause be damned. In the United States, the obscenely unequal funding of public schools in state after state across the country, excuse me, is the devilish details of institutional racism. The title of a 2019 Washington Post article reveals the degree of the discrimination that has only increased with each generation. The title of that article states it very plainly. A report finds $23 billion racial funding gap for schools. Overwhelmingly, white school districts receive $23 billion more than the predominantly non-white school districts in school and local funding in 2016, despite serving roughly the same number of children, a new report finds. The funding gap is largely the result of the reliance on property taxes as the primary source of funding for schools. Despite the landmark ruling in 1954 that separate was unequal and unconstitutional, and that states should proceed with all deliberate speed to integrate their school districts, this country has only propelled backward into an entrenched segregation that confounds our efforts at achieving racial justice. In fact, the only integration that has occurred is the cohesion of race and class oppression into a binding lock based in property tax. In 2018, ProPublica produced a database in which one can literally go onto their site and test to see the level of segregation within their own school district. Based on civil rights data released by the US Department of Education, ProPublica has built an interactive database to examine racial disparities in educational opportunities and school discipline. Look up more than 96,000 individual public and charter schools and 17,000 districts to see how they compare with their counterparts. This map, taken from this database study, shows that wherever Black people live, there we find the highest concentrations of educational isolation and structural neglect. Now, for those of you that have participated in our previous lessons, will find something very interesting in this map. It looks very similar and follows the same pattern of the slide that we discussed that shows the composition or the geographic distribution of African Americans in 1850. So clearly, this truth has carried from then till now. Imagine a Black child sitting in a classroom composed entirely of other Black and Latinx children living in a county where white children also live, learning about the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision. Imagine that child looking around his classroom and wondering what happened. Such history becomes mere fantasy when the separate and unequal conditions experienced by her childhood predecessors are the same conditions she experiences every day in her public school. Outdated textbooks, outmoded technology, if any. In many cases, without any structured recreation or arts programs. Imagine music classes without instruments, asbestos-infected walls and rooms that are too cold in the winter and too hot in the spring, with teachers that are underpaid and overwhelmed. It is a sordid and surreal existence that can only lead to a disdain for one's country or a disdain that turns inward against one's self. To tell such a child to ignore these conditions and study hard to achieve academic success is toying with more than that child's feelings. It is to speak from a place of denial and disregard that child can see right through. The anti-Blackness displayed here is palpable in its disdain for Black people, Black youth, and Black children. It is what enables the school to prison pipeline to exist. Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, addresses the rise of mass incarceration as a lasting vestige of slavery and segregation. The over-policing of Black communities has led to the stark increase in police presence in schools where Black children predominate. The lack of equity, the lack of concern has caused the steady flow of Black children from the classroom into the criminal justice system, penalized for doing things that white kids are easily tolerated for doing. Certain cases in recent years, we've seen children as young as 5 and 6 shackled by police officers, crying and calling for their parents. This is no different in spirit and intent than when their ancestors were trafficked from auction blocks to plantations. It will take nothing short of a movement to change the current realities facing Black children in public schools. As valid and necessary as the successes of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, following the Brown v. Board of Education case was in advancing racial equity in US society, the realities of racial inequity yet indicate that there is much work yet to be done. In that movement, the example of little Ruby Bridges stands like a tall tree in a forest of greatness. This year and this month marks the 60th anniversary of her integrating the elementary school in her Louisiana community. Ruby, born the same year as the Brown decision, would enter the school under federal marshal escort. Mobs of white parents and youth hurled spit, rotten tomatoes, and eggs and all manner of profanities in her direction. Ruby Bridges did not, just get included into the school system there. She was among a number of Black students that had to pass a test created by the county under the auspices of determining what Black students had the smarts to integrate with their white children. She passed the test, and yet white community in mass refused to embrace her as their equal in the classroom. As you see here in this slide, it was not about merit. It was about race prejudice. It was about race hatred. The way this story has been told would have us imagine that a 6-year-old girl woke up one morning and decided on her own to walk downtown and enter that school building. Mind you, this school that Ruby would integrate was literally down the block from where her family lived. The segregated school that she had been attending was miles further away. But again, history would have us believe, the way it's been told, that little Ruby did all this by herself. Scant mention is ever made of the woman most responsible for this historic moment, her mother, Lucille Bridges, seen here in this picture, coming out of the school that first day with Ruby. Miss Bridges passed on earlier this summer. In speaking about her mother, Ruby Bridges said, "My parents are the real heroes. They sent me to that public school because they felt it was the right thing to do." Calling her the mother of the civil rights, calling her a mother of the civil rights movement, Ruby further stated, "Today our country lost a hero, brave, progressive, a champion for change. She helped alter the course of so many lives by setting me out on my path as a 6-year-old girl." I want to note that not only did they have to walk through this mob of white families, they received death threats. Her father lost his job. White parents removed their children from the school. That first year, Ruby integrating the school ends up being taught in a classroom by herself. By herself. No white teacher in the school would teach her, except one woman who was not from the area. She was from Boston, Barbara Henry. Such is the trauma that Ruby experienced. The spirit of that trauma is the trauma that all Black children experience in an educational system that remains hostile to their presence. Lucille Bridges, recollecting herself, said, "I wanted it better for my kids than it was for us, so that my kids could go to school and learn." There are Black parents all over this country this day who would say the same for their children. The megastar athlete LeBron James captures this desire and motivation in this video that is more than a mere commercial ad.
Here comes James. He's all alone.
We always hear about an athlete's humble beginnings. How they emerge from poverty or tragedy to beat the odds.
Cleveland fighting for a trip to their first finals.
They're supposed to be the stories of determination that capture the American dream.
All along way I can hear you crying.
They're supposed to be stories that let you know these people are special.
All around me I can hear. So what is gonna happen now?
But you know what would be really special?
A year after opening, LeBron James's I Promise School is showing results. 90% of the children show.
If there were no more humble beginnings.
This work, the work of educational justice, is based on a simple premise. The hopes and aspirations for success in the life of a Black child should not be hinged on one's ability to run, sing, or dance, but on their capacity to think, to create, and to reason. Black families navigating poverty have been blamed for the often over-exaggerated and over-sensationalized failures of their children when it is the system itself that has failed them. It is not the sole responsibility of a family to ensure the academic success of their children when the gates of educational attainment are guarded by the sentinels of segregation and policed by the legislative lords of inequality. A child's capacity for greatness is determined by their intellect and will, as guided by the equal opportunities afforded them by the society that claims them. This is the justice in educational justice. Thank you for sharing this time with us. Those of you that are interested in learning further, I invite you to consider these texts: The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America; Savage Inequalities, Children in America's Schools by the great Jonathan Kozol; Eyes on the Prize, that storied collection of the civil rights movement; and Living Apart, How the Government Betrayed a Landmark Civil Rights Law. These texts will help you to better appreciate this 100-year story that I tried to capsule in these few moments with you today. And I thank you for, again, being with us. For those that are interested in learning more about the work of Origin, I encourage you to check out the website, racial-justice.org, and look forward to being with you again in our next lesson.